In 1911, 4 men set off by dog sled across northern Canada's most desolate, treacherous, and frozen terrain. Somewhere along this journey, things would go horrifyingly wrong. This is their story. It's hard to really put into words just how beautiful and untouched Canada's Yukon Territory is. It's the westernmost of Canada's 3 territories and shares a border with Alaska, but despite Alaska's own reputation for being the same thing, the Yukon actually beats it by quite a large margin, at least in terms of how sparsely populated it is. Like, for example, Alaska has a population density of just 1.3 people per square mile, while the Yukon is less than 15% of that at just 0.18. This is because, despite being roughly the same size as Spain or Sweden, the Yukon has just 45,000 people that call it home today, most of which are in the capital city of Whitehorse. All this is to say that if you were to get dropped at random somewhere in the cold north that is the Yukon, it might feel like you were quite literally the last human on Earth. Now, if you're wondering why the Yukon is so desolate, the answer is fairly simple, and it has to do with climate and geography. On an average day at any given time of the year, temperatures aren't all that different from the national average, but the Yukon is a place of extremes. When the rest of the country is experiencing what could be described as a bit of a cold snap, chances are the Yukon is nearly uninhabitable. In fact, the village of Snag in the territory holds the record for the lowest temperature ever recorded in North America at minus 81 Fahrenheit or minus 63 Celsius. And incredibly, Snag isn't even located in the territory's northern reaches closer to the Arctic Circle. Then, in terms of geography, the situation isn't much better. There are several mountain ranges in the territory, one of which, the St. Elias Mountains, are the tallest anywhere in Canada and are essentially impassable glaciers year-round. It's also filled with rivers, valleys, bogs, and dense forests. These same dense forests tend to thin out and the trees are much shorter as you go north into the Arctic Circle, but at the same time, that puts you instead in the Arctic tundra, which is even less inhabitable. It's also home to the second largest grizzly bear population in all of Canada, and because of the hot summers and the abundance of fresh water, the mosquitoes are brutally bad as well. It should come as no surprise that more than 100 years ago, there were even fewer people living there, and the number was less than 9,000 across the massive landmass. And as you might imagine, as wired communication like phones had become commonplace in more populated areas of the country, establishing the infrastructure in such an inhospitable place was extremely difficult. In fact, by 1910, there was still none at all, so if you wanted to communicate with anyone at the time, one of the only ways to relay messages was by dog sled. Beginning in 1904, it became a tradition for the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, or NWMP, to guide a dog sled team from Dawson City, Yukon to Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories with bags of mail and correspondence. The leader of this mission was 41-year-old Inspector Francis Joseph Fitzgerald. He was the kind of man who had the kind of credentials you'd expect from someone charged with organizing a 475-mile or 764-kilometer trek across such dangerous territory. He first enlisted in 1888 as a constable in the NWMP, and less than 10 years later he was part of a small group that established an overland route from Edmonton to the Yukon goldfields. Prior to this, outside the First Nations Indigenous people, this route through the Canadian province of British Columbia was a mystery until the team Francis was part of carved it out. In fact, he was so hardened and resourceful that he was even responsible for setting up a police outpost on Herschel Island along the Yukon's northern coast. He then lived there with almost no contact with the outside world for 6 years. At that point, his superiors with the NWMP decided to reassign him elsewhere since he was too valuable to keep in such a dangerous environment and would be more useful elsewhere. When December of 1910 was approaching, the NWMP commissioner made a slight change to the annual trip from Dawson City to Fort McPherson for that year. Instead of starting in Dawson City, he asked that Francis make the journey in the opposite direction and began the journey in Fort McPherson, which he agreed to. On December 21st, Francis led a team of 3 sleds pulled by 15 dogs carrying 1,300 pounds of equipment and provisions, as well as 30 pounds of mail. The group also included 3 others, former Constable Sam Carter, who served as the guide, and Constables Richard O'Hara Taylor and George Francis Kinney. Confident they could travel 15 miles a day at least, the men expected to arrive in Dawson City around mid-January. But to do that, they'd have to successfully traverse the Yukon in the harshest season of the year. As things got underway though, the team encountered nothing but good fortune. The temperatures were harsh but typical for the northern Yukon, and they were able to advance about 65 miles or 105 kilometers within the first 4 days. Trouble, however, wasn't far behind them and initially had nothing to do with the weather or terrain. Expeditions through the Yukon at the time were only as successful as their guides. Sam, who was 41 years old, was a carpenter before he joined the NWMP as a special constable, and just before the expedition he had retired from the force. Despite this, he was added to the party because it was believed that he was intimately familiar with the route they'd be taking to Dawson City. In reality, however, Sam had only taken the journey once before and had been in the opposite direction. In addition to that, it was also 4 years earlier. Even still, on December 26th, the men were making great time and had covered 19 miles or 30 kilometers in their first 6 hours of travel that day, but then Sam realized that it was all for nothing. He had been looking for a specific crossing over the Peel River, but he had somehow missed it, and where he had made that mistake wasn't discovered until the team came across a First Nations camp. Without much they could do that night still, the men stayed at the camp that night, and the first thing the next morning, Francis hired a native man named Esau George. He would help to break a trail for the dogs through the deep snow and get the team back on the right track. And although this navigation error was initially concerning, the worry they felt the previous day when they were lost was gone under Esau's guidance, and the team was back on its excellent pace. They then quickly caught up with where they should have been had they not missed the river crossing. On January 1st, 1911, the group came upon a cabin located along Mountain Creek, which marked the successful completion of their second leg of the journey. This is when Francis made a decision that would have disastrous consequences. He paid Esau the $24 he owed him, thanked him for his services, and sent him back home. This was a curious decision for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the patrol hadn't even been underway for a full week before Sam made a critical navigation error that cost the team time, and it could have put them in a much worse scenario if they hadn't stumbled on the First Nations camp. They weren't exactly traveling an established route, and there was no signage indicating the different mountains, lakes, and streams they'd encounter along the way. To successfully lead a team to its destination, the guide needed to have such a deep knowledge of the route that he could decipher one mountain from another or even one tree from another by sight alone. Sam had already shown that he might not have quite that understanding of the area. And second, an extra guide would have also made them that much more efficient because it would be another set of legs breaking a trail for the dog sleds. Essentially, guides would lead on foot ahead of the sleds, and the sleds would follow in the tracks left by the guides. This was particularly necessary in deep snow like they were encountering along the route. And finally, another reason why this was puzzling was that a second guide could have kept a lookout for game to supplement their food rations. Dog sleds are noisy and have a tendency to scare away other animals, but guides can travel much more quietly, which can often present an opportunity to get a shot off at a meal or two. However, either way, Sal and the team parted ways at Mountain Creek and the patrol continued en route to Dawson City. Conditions by this point had also deteriorated compared to the start of the journey. Winter in the Yukon is already harsh enough, and it was especially temperamental during the winter of 1910 and 1911. The team had to battle through heavy snowfall, strong winds that literally hurt their skin, and an average temperature each day of minus 51 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 46 Celsius. At the very least, Sam managed to guide them in the correct direction for the better part of the next 2 weeks. This unfortunately wouldn't last much longer. Following along the Little Wind River, Sam was searching for another stream known as Forest Creek, which was crucial for getting the team through the Richardson Mountains. Sam continued leading the patrol south along the Little Wind, believing that Forest Creek was ahead of him, but he had actually missed it by 8 miles. This path along the Little Wind River to Forest Creek is about 40 miles, which was a trip that should have taken the men 2 days. When they realized they were once again lost, none of them knew how far back they had gone. Had they known they were only less than a day's trek back to the start of Forest Creek, this wouldn't have been that big of an issue, but Francis continued to trust Sam's route, and Sam would end up leading them further and further down Little Wind River. As their predicament became more and more clear, however, Francis had a decision to make. They could either keep trying to locate Forest Creek, or they could turn back to Fort McPherson. This was when another crucial mistake was made. Fearing the embarrassment of failure, Francis decided to press on in hopes they'd come across the turnoff toward Dawson City eventually. 1 day then turned into 2, then 2 into 3, and by the time Francis decided that their best move was to return to Fort McPherson, the men had wasted 9 days, and thus 9 more days of food rations just trying to find a creek. By this point, they were more than 26 days into a journey they brought 30 days worth of food rations for, and they weren't even halfway. Finally, on January 18th, they began the trek back to Fort McPherson, which was about 250 miles back the way they came. All they had left was just 10 pounds of flour and 8 pounds of bacon left for them to share, and for the dogs, only a few pounds of dried fish remained. Somehow this dwindling supply of food went unnoticed during more than a week of tracing and retracing their tracks in search of Forest Creek. So when the men made camp that night, they supplemented what little they had left by sacrificing one of the dogs for meat. 2 days later, the flour and bacon were gone, leaving just dried fish, tea, and the remaining dogs. As if this wasn't enough to deal with between heavy snowfall and what was already on the ground, travel was extremely slow if they were able to advance at all. Then on January 24th, the men were faced with temperatures reaching minus 56 Fahrenheit or minus 49 Celsius, but even worse than that, they reached a river crossing. Sam and Richard would end up going in up to their waists and were in such bad shape afterward that they had to stop and camp at 11 a.m. Almost every night that followed, one of the dogs was sacrificed to feed the men and the other dogs, who always seemed hesitant to eat what they were being served. Another couple of days later, Richard got sick on January 27th, and by the 30th, all the men were sick. Francis noted in his journal that he believed this was the result of eating dog liver. By day 40, the team had barely progressed 100 miles close to Fort McPherson. The Peel River was still 80 miles away, and this was the most treacherous leg of the journey, one that required them to go over 2 mountains. And even though the men were sacrificing the dogs and they had full bellies, they were in terrible condition. On that last day of January, skin was peeling off their faces and their lips were chapped to the point of splitting. The cold was taking a significant toll on them, and things just continued to get worse. The temperature dropped to minus 62 Fahrenheit or minus 52 Celsius that day, making travel impossible. They were also weak and exhausted too, not so much from the lack of food, but from a lack of nutrition. Scurvy, which is a condition caused by a lack of vitamin C that can lead to death, had set in, as did frostbite. Still, Francis somehow remained positive through the ordeal, noting in his journal on February 3rd that he believed they were only about 100 miles from Fort McPherson and that they'd make it there alive. Hundreds of miles away in Dawson City, those expecting the patrol weren't terribly concerned that they were late arriving. Considering the harshness of that winter and the difficult travel in the Yukon in the best of winter conditions, a delay was almost to be expected. Not only that, but this trek had been completed successfully each year since 1904, so there was little reason in early February to doubt that Francis and the rest of the team would show up eventually. Everything changed, however, when Asao arrived in Dawson City around the middle of the month. After he was released from duty by Francis, Asao returned to his camp and then traveled with the others to Dawson City, making good time and arriving without issue. He inquired about the patrol he helped guide, believing that they had beaten him there by weeks, but he was shocked to learn that they were still unaccounted for. This finally raised the alarm in the city, and an NWMP relief party was formed, but it would take some time to prepare and stock up on the necessary supplies. It wasn't until the last day of February that the party was ready to leave, and they set off with a highly qualified guide in the direction of Fort McPherson. For almost a month, the relief party encountered and endured the same brutal conditions that Francis and his team faced, but because they remained on track, they were able to keep a steady pace throughout the journey. Then, on March 21st, one of them spotted what appeared to be a campsite ahead. As they approached it, it was clear that it had been there for a while, but they were initially encouraged that they were catching up to wherever Francis's patrol was. It wasn't until they reached the campsite that hope for a successful rescue vanished. What they found was a burned out fire with a kettle in the middle of it. Inside the kettle was the leather from part of a sled harness, which the men had started eating after the rations ran out and the dogs were gone. Then, next to the dead campfire were the bodies of George and Richard. It was clear that George had passed away from starvation, but not Richard. He instead had a gunshot wound in the side of his head. This was a horrific find that started to piece together the story of what the patrol faced, but a clear picture wouldn't be formed until the next day. That's when the relief party came across Sam's body, and just a few hundred yards from him was Francis. Both died of exposure and starvation just 25 miles or 40 kilometers from the safety of Fort McPherson. Because of the way their bodies were positioned, it was apparent that Francis was the last surviving member of the team. Sam's body had been laid out with dignity, with his hands crossing over his chest and his face covered with a handkerchief. Meanwhile, it appeared that Francis had simply laid down for one last time before he died. Among the other items found at the campsite was the journal that Francis had kept throughout the patrol, and his entries revealed much about the suffering the team experienced. His last entry came on February 5th. After such an optimistic entry on February 3rd, whatever they experienced in their next 48 hours caused Francis to remark that he had lost the last bit of hope he had remaining. He wrote as much in his final entry before outright placing the blame on himself for trusting Sam after he initially got them lost. Based on the date in the entry as well, the relief party realized that the men were likely dead for 3 weeks before they even left Dawson City. Also, on a page torn from the journal that was found on his body, Francis wrote a short will that left all his possessions to his mother, who lived in Ireland. The relief party then gathered up the bodies of the 4 men and placed them on their sleds with relative ease, since each of them weighed just 100 pounds at the time of their deaths. All 4 of them were then taken to Fort McPherson, where they were buried side by side. In all, the men were estimated to have traveled about 620 miles or 1,000 kilometers over the course of 53 days during one of the coldest winters on record. Their tragedy is now known as the Lost Patrol. In the aftermath of the incident, several causes of the unfortunate outcome were determined, and most of the blame was placed on Francis. Many believed he was overconfident and his ego got in the way of rational decision-making. Like, for example, instead of turning back to Fort McPherson when he should have, he decided to continue searching for Forest Creek for far longer than was safe or responsible. In preparation for the journey as well, he didn't account for nearly enough food rations for potential delay, and he failed to notice how much their supply had been used until it was too late to begin reducing rations. On top of that, his decision to part ways with the sow was determined to be short-sighted, and his trust in Sam was misplaced. All of these things combined for a worst-case scenario for the patrol. In the years that followed, from 1911 to 1924, the patrol continued to run using lessons learned from the Lost Patrol. Each of the future patrols always hired a native guide, and food and supply caches were established along the way, just in case. Cabins were also built on the path, and the Forest Creek Trail was clearly marked so that it would be impossible to miss. These adjustments are credited for the remainder of the patrols running without another tragic incident. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. As tragic and brutal as this story was, these types of expeditions in treacherous conditions are some of the stories that I find to be the most compelling. So, if you know of any similar stories, and particularly those that are lesser known, that you think might fit the channel, you can submit them to the form found in the description. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one.